Nietzsche's horse. Namaste. Friedrich Nietzsche is among the greatest of philosophers in the Western world. Nietzsche, however, sank into catatonic state at the sight of a horse who died in front of him. Nietzsche never recovered. What happened to Nietzsche as has always been of great interest to psychology. Manshu Vaidyaji takes us into the esoteric event. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
So, can we start with Nietzsche's story?
Nietzsche was a philosopher, one of the greatest that Western world has seen. And he grew up in a very religious atmosphere. His father was a minister. His mother was a devout Christian. Nietzsche himself started with the study of theology. Later on, he became completely antagonistic to Christianity and popular theology of that time and became a professor. He taught philology and philosophy, and very early in life, he came out as an extraordinary philosopher. Very early, he became a full professor. Very early, he got himself on a chair of the faculty. And then his health started deteriorating. He then took to living alone and writing. And across his life, apart from his mother and sister, because the father died very early, he had only two strong attachments. One was with a friend who was a famous musician, Wagner, and second was a girl he fell for, who did not reciprocate his advances. Apart from it, it was a very lonely life and a very sick life. In one sense, Nietzsche parallels very closely Kierkegaard when it comes to the personal life, with some differences, but largely on same track. Both of them had a very sickly constitution. Both of them lived by and large alone. Both of them produced philosophy which was appreciated much after they had passed away. Kierkegaard used to say, "Only the day after tomorrow belongs to me." Nietzsche did not say it, but he had the same fate like Kierkegaard, that only the day after tomorrow belongs to me. While Nietzsche was writing his philosophy, and much of it was done, Nietzsche was passing through his midlife, and he had not been keeping well for some time. And at the age of around 44, this incident happened, which is disputed, but most people believe it happened. The incident was a horse owner who was on a horse cart was beating up his horse, and the horse could not take it any longer and it collapsed. And Nietzsche saw it and ran to him, held him in his arms, and he said, "I can feel what you feel, I can understand you." And after that incident, Nietzsche went back, and a period of complete withdrawal and incoherence started. From modern day standpoint, you can call him the onset of a psychosis, a schizophrenia with negative symptoms. And Nietzsche never recovered after that. He was then taken to an asylum for an year. And then his mother took him back home. And then he lived with his mother and sister. When the mother passed away, it was his sister who took care of him. But by that time, the ideological movement in Germany had started. and Nietzsche's work
Okay.
was hijacked to suit the Nazi ideology. And it is said that Nietzsche's sister, in order to make up for what she was spending on him, started charging tickets where people would come and look at Nietzsche after taking a ticket, and he became tragically almost like a object in a zoo. And he barely spoke a few statements after that incident of the horse. It
Oh,
is said 2 or 3 statements which people know he spoke of were like this. Once he was taking a walk with his sister and mother, and he said, "We are happy, are we not?" And again slided back into silence. And often, after his mother passed away, and his sister was talking to somebody else in the other room, who were people who had come to see him were discussing books, Nietzsche's face lit up and he said, "Ah, I have also written some good books." And again he went back into silence. And in the same state, he passed away.
oh,
So this tragedy of one of the greatest thinkers that the Western civilization has produced, and this enigmatic mystery as to what happened to Nietzsche that he slided into such a state, that has been a subject of continued enigma and mystery, both for medicine and psychoanalysis. So this was
indeed.
the story, a very tragic, a very enigmatic, and a very inviting story of Nietzsche.
So when we listen to such a tragic and unfortunate end of this personality, what was he philosophically occupied with comes to our mind, because the understanding with which he has lived throughout his life, which translated into something else, which triggered from a painful event. So what was his philosophically the thinking patterns and the thought processes which he created for all of us?
Nietzsche was centrally occupied with uh, 3 core issues, philosophically speaking. The first core issue was he used to say God is dead. And he would mean by that to say God is dead and therefore man is free. The second issue that he was occupied with was the issue of the true world. And I'll explain what these things are in a moment. So the first was God is dead. The second was the true world. And the third philosophical issue was the hope in man. And that led to the concept of a superman because there was no hope in man. So he was at the center of a great crisis in human civilization. The crisis was this, and this brings us to his first point of God is dead. He lived in a time where human civilization was moving through a profound crisis. And the crisis was this. The history of Western civilization, you can divide into 2 long periods of history. The first was the Greek period of reason, and the second was the
Hmm.
Christian period of faith. And when Nietzsche arrived on the scene, the Christian era was coming to an end. And the central question then was, if the church and the Bible and the Christ were not to provide us the moral compass of right and wrong, how will the human civilization be structured? What will be our right and wrong? And if there is no divine authority from which we can derive our right and wrong, then the right and wrong will just be a function of what human beings think. And human thought is very fragile, very labile, very unreliable. So, how do you create a fundamental structure of a civilization without God? How do you create a new culture which can lead the human society to a better state than before. And we have been shortchanged by now by both reason and faith. And so there is nowhere to go. Where do we go? The Greek reason did not provide us fulfillment. The Christian faith did not provide us fulfillment. So we were shortchanged by both God and reason, and there was no third place to go. Where do we go? So this was the fundamental problem of Nietzsche, that if God is dead, and by that it does not mean he has solved the problem of theism or atheism. He is talking
Right.
of God in an operational social sense.
Hmm.
That I can pass 3 months of my life doing everything that I do without thinking for a God for a moment. Which means whatever I say in theological terms, in everyday terms, God is dead for me.
True.
And this has been true ever since the Industrial Revolution. So the first was God is dead and man is free. And now, in that freedom, what do we choose to do? And what is it that we ought to do to create a good civilization? And this birth pangs of a new civilization was what Nietzsche took upon himself as a responsibility to think out. And obviously, nobody can do justice to it. It's too big a task for any individual.
In that
So,
lifetime,
yeah,
in one lifetime, it's
correct. So Nietzsche was preoccupied with the weight on his shoulders of conceptualizing a world without God. The second was his theme of the true world.
hmm.
And this theme Nietzsche found ever since Plato.
Okay.
That ever since Plato, there has been this belief that the world that we see is not the absolute elemental real world. And it
Hmm.
is an operational world, and beyond this, there is another world. So, this world may be full of injustice, lack of fulfillment, stupidities, brutality. But there is another world which is just, which is harmonious, which is happy, which is loving, which is fulfilling. And that world was conceptualized both by people of faith and people of reason. Plato talked about that world as the world of eternal forms, the shadows of which are seen by our sense, mind, and conceptual apparatus. So, what we are seeing are shadows on the wall, but the real objects are somewhere else. And the real objects are the Platonic eternals in the eternal world of forms. So this is how the rationalist, the Platonic, not the rationalist, but the Platonic philosophers of
Reasoning.
reason, they conceptualize the world, that there is a true world out there, a world of fulfillment other than the world that we live in. And then came the believers, and they talked about heaven. The true world acquired a different color and flavor. The eligibility to enter the true world changed, but the concept remained the same, that there is a
Hmm.
world of fulfillment, of happiness, apart from the world that we live in. And Nietzsche was preoccupied with this idea that it has never left Western civilization, the idea of a true world. And this,
Hmm.
according to Nietzsche, took one away from the real world and the challenge of converting the real world into a true world. It provided an escapism from the injustice and the struggle of this world. And the third was, in the light of the above two, what can you hope for man to achieve? And Nietzsche did not have much appreciation for the ordinary man. He was not a great admirer of collective wisdom. He saw
Mhm.
collective stupidity to be more the outcome of the masses than collective wisdom. So he looked down upon democracy. He used to call it this mania of counting noses, the rule of shopkeepers.
Right.
That how can the best ever come up to the top in this kind of an electoral process where the one who gets the most funding wins? So
Absolutely.
essentially, it is the rule of shopkeepers. The shopkeepers fund politicians, and the one who gets best funded wins. So he did not have much good things to say about democracy, that the best and the noblest will rise to the top only in an aristocratic setup, not in a democratic setup. And then the question was, what is the noblest and the best of the human race likely to be? And are they enough? And Nietzsche felt no. That the world that ought to be created cannot be created by even the best among us. And we are passing through a crisis of the species. It is not a social crisis or an economic or a political crisis, it's an evolutionary crisis. That our desires for fulfillment are such that under no organization that human beings can create, we can have a sense of fulfillment. So we have to exceed ourselves in our hardware. We have to change the nature of things. And a Superman has to emerge. And only the next species, the Superman, can really create the good world that we want to be created. And Nietzsche wrote about all of this in his books. And the most popular of his books was Thus Spake Zarathustra.
Okay.
And
Which
Zarathustra,
translates to?
huh?
What does it translates to?
uh, so spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra is a
Okay.
character which people say
Okay.
was inspired by Zoroaster.
Okay.
So the story that Nietzsche tells is this, that Zarathustra is the wise man who
Hmm.
roams on the mountains for years in search of the truth. Finally, he finds it, and after years, he decides to come down so that he can share the truth that he has found with fellow beings. And as he comes down, the first person he meets is an old man that people call is a wise man. And he talks to him and he tells him that God is dead. And it is we who have killed him. We are the murderer of all murderers. And we have killed everything that was holy in civilization. And we have blood on our hands. And how shall we be able to wash out this blood from our hands? And how shall we create the new world, the new civilization? So, and then it goes on to the whole concept of the Superman. And apart from it, he wrote certain other books, The Birth of Tragedy, Beyond Good and Evil, one very popular book, Human All Too Human. So this was the philosophical uh, engagement of Nietzsche.
Right. So, sir, can you pause? So when we talk about Nietzsche's philosophy, we see he's talking about the true world, which seems to be a very balanced place, which is not operational right now in the present times and from last as many years the civilizations have been existing. When we see the dark side of the reality and the light side of the reality, which is being balanced by the basic structure or moral structure of personified as God, right? Who's the balancer between the two sides, which can also be the ethical self or the moral self of the human race. So could he actually solve the problem of foundation of these ethics, the morality?
He could not, and nobody can. what he does is he deconstructs the traditional ideals and shows how they are a cover up for human weaknesses, human fallacies. Right. And he then comes to power as a core value. His famous statement
Power.
is power.
Okay.
So he comes to a core value, right? And this is where he dislikes Christianity the most, because Christianity elevates or appreciates the weak, whereas he is a worshipper of power, the titan. His famous statement
Hmm.
is a will to power, a will to overpower, a will to an endless power. So he could not actually establish, but he did write about it. He wrote transvaluation of all values. That how do we establish a new set of values in a world without God, in a world of the Superman? And this obviously he could not do beyond dispute. So he did say about it, but the core value came out to be power. Equality was not something that he appreciated much. He was at the heart an aristocrat.
Okay.
He was not a democrat. So unlike Plato, he did not create a republic, a conceptual scheme of the ideal world, but he did deconstruct and oppose the traditional values. And he did exalt aristocracy and the primacy of power among human motivations.
That's quite interesting. That is parallelly in my mind. That Eastern concept of Shiva comes up when you talk about the omnipotent, powerful, uh, superhuman,
Right.
pure conscious from the true idol self. That is what I'm coming in touch with. So, is there any background where he got inspired from the Eastern concepts
Uh, he
of
did
God?
he did read a bit of Buddhism, and he was deeply
Hmm.
influenced by Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer was deeply influenced by Buddhism
Okay.
because
Is it because they consider the world as a suffering world, and that is where the resonance started with, that this
yes,
current world is full of pain,
yeah,
the pessimistic outlook of it?
yeah, because there is one thing common between Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. All the three of them lived practically a life in a hostel.
Okay.
I mean, they never lived with families, they never lived with people. Right? They lived all alone, and that
Hmm.
is common. The conditions were different.
Yeah.
Schopenhauer medically and financially was far well off. Kierkegaard financially was very well off, although medically not very well off. Nietzsche
Okay.
neither financially nor medically was very well off.
So when you talk about the backgrounds of such a personality who gave such profound principles in his own ways, and how tragic the end was, it brings into the psychoanalytic concept of the background of one's own personality. So how was his life like, and how was his childhood? What he lived?
Uh, he lost his father very early. He mimicked his father in a very uh, Oedipal way. He took the same profession like his father initially, and then he defied his father. So first he was in full conformity, he was into Christian theology, and then he became completely against Christianity, against the father.
So boils down to the same concept: man in search of
Yeah,
father or
so
God.
there was a very early loss of the father and the real Oedipal victory, and there was a early conformity and then defiance of the father, and a very strong bond with both the mother and the sister. We don't know, but I suspect based upon my own theory of the Valley Junction model of personality disorders, that he would have experienced a very early life object loss. Because we see all the manifestations in adult life. He had a
Absolutely.
great difficulty in emotional closeness. You can, from DSM standpoint, you can easily trace the narcissistic personality disorder, the schizoidal personality disorder. And I think they would
And the
go
trigger of
along with
his episode of psychosis also was a loss,
uh,
witnessing death of helpless on the
right,
mercy of the master, which is evident enough for some regression to the very early age object loss.
right. So he had a very fragile ego. He was a fragile narcissist.
Right.
And I think he would have had some sexual difficulties. It seems he visited a prostitute in his young age and got infected with syphilis.
Oh.
And later on in life, he would have very few friends, very schizoidal trait. And he would find it very difficult to keep relationships for a long time. It was only once
Do
that
you
he actually,
suspect an underlying bisexuality also in his personality, owing to his fragile narcissism, the triggering event of his life, and early loss of Oedipus object?
it can be a latent bisexual constitution. It can be. We don't get confirmation of it from his writings, in the sense that
Okay.
we don't see him in fling with any man or writing letters to any man or falling for any man in that sense. But in the latent
Mhm.
sense, there can be a component. What we see definitely for sure is a fragile ego, a narcissistic constitution, a very high sort of intellect, very schizoidal kind of emotional
Mm.
orientation, and uh, a severe deficit of attachment portfolio. Like he could
Mm.
never create a healthy attachment portfolio of being attached to 5 to 7 people in the external world. And this was his constitution and his events. And I'm sure many of the sicknesses that he had were psychosomatic. Like he had constant dizziness, migraine, diarrhea, all of which are outcomes of somatization of anxiety. So, in all probability, he had conversion disorder by today's definition, and somatization of affect, and the affect could not be treated, and therefore, if he had been to psychotherapy, probably he would have been lived a much better life. But he never went for psychotherapy, and the affect was uh, destructive. So this was the psychoanalytic background, and later on in a moment's time, we will go into how Jung looked at it and how I would look at it slightly differently. But this is how psychoanalytically we can look at the life story of the person. Very narcissistic, very schizoidal, um, split open, fragile ego, uh, unable to be emotionally close to people and sustain relationships, inability of maintaining a healthy attachment portfolio, and a severe midlife crisis,
Mm.
because the event of that horse happened just at around the midlife period.
Oh,
And midlife is very difficult for narcissistic characters, especially those who have not succeeded. And
the vulnerable narcissist.
yeah, so this is the psychoanalytic short story of Nietzsche.
When we see the pathogenesis of the personality based on psychoanalysis of Nietzsche, and when we talk about the triggering event of his life. How does psychoanalysis look at this collapse into senility at the sight of a dead horse and the beating received by the master? How it must have been interpreted in this personality?
This has been a enigmatic event for, I think, about a century now, as to what happened
Indeed.
to Nietzsche. And two explanations have been given, two on the medical side and two on the psychoanalytic side. On the medical side, the two explanations are, one explanation is of syphilis. The second explanation is of tumor.
Of tumor.
Tumor. And of course, there is no way of knowing it because we can't do an autopsy now. But these are the two probabilities on the medical side. On the psychoanalytic side, one way was to look at it as a long prodrome of schizophrenia, finally ending with the story of the horse. And the second was what Carl Jung gave as a explanation. And he said this was because he was overwhelmed and he drowned in the archetype of the old wise man. So it was when he drowned in the archetype of the old wise man, instead of being inspired by an archetype or integrating part of the archetype in one's self, when you get drowned completely into an archetype, it results in psychosis. So he got drowned in the archetype of the old wise man. Some other Jungians say that he got drowned not in the old wise man, but in the archetype of the hero. So these are the psychoanalytic underpinnings of it. I would explain it from my own standpoint of the Valley Junction model. That there would be an early life object loss, because of which there would be a fragile self, narcissism and schizoidal traits, mixed personality disorder, which would watch up the Oedipus, which would create sexual problems and emotional closeness problems. And then the father dies, and the Oedipal victory and the guilt occurs. And the castration anxiety also occurs. So the split is open. The valley state is active. Oedipus is not negotiated through. Castration anxiety and guilt continues. The victory to have mother and sister all for himself continues. And then there is a long period of frustrating life where he was not as adequately appreciated as he wanted it to be. So like Kierkegaard, like Van Gogh, only the day after tomorrow belonged to him. So he lived a very frustrating life, and he had done all that he had to by the time he was 42. And then the midlife started. And with all this baggage of loneliness, of failure in relationships with both Wagner and the girl, it's like a schizoidal person hardly gets into an attachment. And if that fails, it's very difficult. So the pain is so high that you develop the schema of never again. And then the tragedy follows that you are a lonely man, a sick man, an unappreciated man despite your genius. And you're battling all the suffering all alone. And the midlife comes. And you are finding it difficult to take the midlife. And you also recognize all that you had to do has been done. And that deep sense of disappointment and resignation, which comes to a deeply talented and frustrated narcissist in midlife, that happens. And then the event of the horse happens. That is where the horse inside of Nietzsche finally dies. The horse which was keeping him going finally died at the midlife. And that is where the withdrawal became complete and total. So
which we could take a free association from Nietzsche about horse, if it is to do with the power, which he overemphasized in his philosophy. When the
yeah,
powerful becomes powerless and dies at the mercy of some brutal person,
yeah.
it's the
So
end of the true world for him.
correct, true. So we need a little more discussion about the symbolism of the horse,
Yes,
and we'll continue in the second part. This part is coming to an end, so let me just uh, start
very
afresh
interesting.
in the next part. On the same, we'll continue the same
Yes,
question on the symbolism of the horse, Nietzsche's horse.
right. So we connect in part 2 with the same discussion, Nietzsche's horse. Thank you.